Hey there. Today I want to tell you about a really crazy new bylaw that was just passed in Calgary at their city council. The new bylaw passed this March restricts protests around city libraries and city recreation facilities like community and fitness centers. The new bylaw only restricts, though, certain types of protests, namely protests that express objection or disapproval to ideas or actions related to a number of different factors like race, religion, color, gender identity, gender expression, physical disability, mental disability, age, ancestry, place of origin, marital status, source of income, family status, or sexual orientation. So this bylaw prohibits protests of that nature on publicly accessible property within 100 meters of an entrance to a library or rec center. So what this means is that you could have a climate extinction rebellion protest beside a library, but you can't protest if it relates to one of these forbidden topics. We are fighting back against this bylaw because courts have long held that the right to freedom of expression is content neutral. The government doesn't get to pick and choose the topics which are acceptable or unacceptable to protest. I can't wait to tell you all about what we're planning. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Christine, and I'm the litigation director for the Canadian Constitution Foundation, a legal charity that fights for fundamental freedoms in Canada. I upload regular videos about our ongoing legal cases and about other interesting developments in constitutional law in Canada. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, please hit like and subscribe below. It really helps my videos out a lot. Also, please remember, nothing in my videos is legal advice. If you have your own legal question or problem, consult your own lawyer. So this new bylaw in Calgary was passed on March 14th, and the next day, March 15th, I put out a press release announcing that we were going to be challenging it. And I created a portal where people who disagree with this law can send me their information, including their story about how this law affects them, and they can also let me know if they would be interested in participating in our legal challenge. You can send me your story about what you think by visiting the ccf.ca/Calgary protest ban. Now, as I said, the bylaw only restricts certain types of protests. So protests about express this objection or disapproval around ideas or actions related to things like race, religion, gender identity, disability, sexual orientation, and place of origin. The bylaw, therefore, is not content neutral. It only prohibits specific types of protests that the government doesn't like. And the courts have been very clear in many, many cases that the right to freedom of expression is content neutral. The content of the expression, no matter how offensive or unpopular or even disturbing it is, that doesn't deprive it of its Section 2B charter protection. It is not for the government to tell Canadians or Calgarians what they may or may not protest. And this bylaw has a $10,000 fine associated with it. It is unconstitutional and it should never have been passed. And that's why we are making plans for a legal challenge. I think that the bylaw is just a really clear example of a short-sighted council pushing, and actually in this case, they rushed through this unconstitutional bylaw because of a current cultural flashpoint. The debate at council makes it very clear that the concern driving the rush to enact this protest ban is because of protests around something called Drag Queen Story Hour. This is a public event for children these types of things are held at libraries around the world, and drag queens come in and read books to children. These events have resulted in quite disruptive protests in Calgary and actually around the world by those who object to drag and view it as an inappropriate art form for children. It's also been interrupted by counter-protesters who want to support the LGBTQ community and support the continuation of these events. Now, this is a current flashpoint. It's really messy, and it's being worked out in public debate between opposing voices. But Calgary's bylaw has silenced that debate, including the counter-protesters, and it has relegated these types of protests and many others to a government-approved corner. Now, whatever you think of Drag Queen Story Hour or the protests for or against it, Calgarians still have a right to protest both for and against. And indeed, they have a right to protest not just about this type of event, but on any topic that they choose. Now, Calgary City Council has also closed its eyes to the potential unforeseen consequences of the bylaw, which is intended to address Drag Queen Story Hour protests, but will actually has the potential to silence all kinds of speech that these councillors may themselves agree with. Now, I want to take some time to explain some of these unforeseen consequences. So today in Calgary, this new bylaw would prohibit protests near libraries around female genital mutilation, which is a religious cultural practice in some parts of the world that is an internationally recognized human rights violation. It's horrifying. It involves the partial or even total removal of external female genitals for non-medical reasons. It is causing immediate as well as lifelong health complications for some 200 million girls around the world, but it's rooted in religion and culture. So if an author had written about her experience with female genital mutilation, and there are many authors who have written about this, of surviving this horrible practice, if she wanted to speak at a library, many people might want to go and show their support for her and their opposition to this internationally recognized human rights violation. But if they did, they might actually be subject to a $10,000 fine for expressing disapproval of a religious practice. Now, I think that everyone, including the drafters of this stupid bylaw, would agree that that is an outcome that nobody wants. Now, if this isn't bad enough, the bylaw would also prohibit protests opposing child marriage as a religious practice and protests either for or against the expansion of medically assisted dying, since that touches on both physical and mental disability. It could prohibit protests related to safe injection sites if the protests are near libraries, because safe injection and safer supply initiatives, those are touching on issues of physical and mental disability. This law could also prohibit protests related to international armed conflict. For example, people protesting related to the war in Ukraine could trigger the bylaw to the extent that they may express disapproval of Russia as a place of origin. Similarly, protests, basically any protest related to the dispute between Israelis and Palestinians could also trigger this bylaw. But of course, other types of protests would still be permitted. For example, protests about the economy, the environment, or labor issues, those wouldn't trigger the bylaw. And in my view, it is absolutely abhorrent that Calgary City Council would enact a bylaw that permits pipeline protests, but prohibits protests against female genital mutilation and international armed conflict. This is just so short-sighted, it's authoritarian, it was rushed through, and it's patently unconstitutional. It infringes on our right to freedom of expression. The courts have been very clear that this is a content-neutral right. It's not for the government to be doing this and to putting on the sidelines protests that they happen to disagree with. It shows the consequences of governing in a knee-jerk manner, of rushing through a bylaw without thinking of the unexpected impact. And it also shows the consequences of this illiberal thinking that would have the government approve our speech, relegating what they don't like to the fringes, lest we face a massive $10,000 financial penalty. You know, open debate is how we work out our differences as a society. And it's actually how we define the contours of all of our other rights. Freedom of expression is not a right for the powerful. It is a right that most benefits the powerless. And this bylaw is going to silence many voices that we need to hear. That's why it needs to be repealed, or it needs to be fought and struck down, which is exactly what we are fighting for. So Head to the ccf.ca/Calgary protest ban to tell me your story about what you think of this bylaw. And of course, you can also support the costs associated with bringing this case by making a tax-deductible charitable donation at the ccf.ca/donate. Okay, that's all for this update. Thanks for watching, and let's keep fighting for freedom in Canada.